For me, this podcast has a simple mission, and it is to act as a bridge between our generations. We talk about life, we talk about culture, music, their successes, their failures, their regrets, and their legacies. So my guest in this episode is a medical doctor, a lawyer, and I joked on this episode that if it also been an engineer, he would have won the trifecta of what many African parents desire for their children to accomplish in their lives. So not just that, he's also served in the Nigerian Army and also in the British Army for close to 30 years or thereabouts. We have such a fascinating and amazing conversation. We touch on a few different topics. And without taking any more time, I want you to enjoy this conversation. This is Dr. Akintunde Akinkunmi. So thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me. For the sake of the people listening, I'd like to start with, what is your full name?
My name is Akintunde Akinkunmi. The full name, Akintunde Akinkunmi.
Oh, cool. Yeah. What year were you born?
I was born in 1965 on the 10th of January.
Okay, and I'll give some context because I already know this. So you are a medical doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an author, you served in two armies.
Correct.
For everyone who might be considering this, and I know it's on the minds of the listeners, how happy are your parents with your achievement, with your accomplishments?
Well, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I lost my dad when I was quite young. I was 19, fourth year in medical school. So he never lived to see any of it. If you indeed you call them accomplishments. My mum, That's a harder one because for two reasons. One is she wasn't madly keen on the army idea.
I see.
And there's a story behind that which I'm happy to go into. But I think the rest of it, I think she thinks it wasn't too shabby.
Because if you were also an engineer, that would be the trifecta of the African parents' dream for their children is either be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. You would have had all three. Well,
the engineering bit was probably way beyond my capabilities, given the fact that it took me 3 goes to pass O-level maths, and I can to this day I can barely count past 10 without taking my shoes and socks off.
Do you remember what your parents did for a living when they had you when you were born? What was your father's occupation?
My late dad was a pediatric hematologist. He did medical laboratory technology, so he did a lot of work in kind of researching sickle cell and stuff like that in kids. And my mum was a hospital administrator, so I was born in the hospital that they both worked in, University College Hospital in Ibadan, and that's where I went to medical school as well.
Full circle.
Yeah. So that's what they did. Yeah.
And are you? Do you have many siblings, or are you an only child? Or?
I'm the eldest of. Well, there were 5 of us. Now there are 4. So I have 2 surviving younger brothers and a sister, who's the baby of the family.
And growing up, was it a close-knit family? Were you really close with your siblings and your parents, or
I think yes and no. I mean, I look back now, and I think in some ways, actually, outsiders who look at my brothers and I in particular, to a lesser degree my sister, kind of think we're kind of a slightly odd family from the perspective that we're not great talkers. None of us is great talkers. So we're all content to kind of sit in the same space and not say a word to each other unless there's something to be said. But kind of idle chatter wasn't really our forte.
Small talk wasn't,
Yeah. I mean, we did it every now and then, but and then when you have kind of, for a long time, there was just 4 of us, four boys, all of whom had huge appetite. So time spent talking was less time to eat, and the more you talk, the less you got to eat.
Yeah. What would you say was your earliest memory of your family life growing up? What do you first remember?
My first memory actually is shortly after we moved. We used to live on the campus of the University of Ibadan, and we moved from a flat. I think I was probably about 2.5 at the time, to a house, and I remember that there were 3 huge trees in the front garden. I mean, those houses then, senior staff quarters were on huge plots of land. In fact, the other day I actually drove past it. I took my wife there to say this is the house I grew up in. Looks very different now.
I was about to ask if it looked anything like what it did.
Oh, no, it's completely different, like everything else in Nigeria. So, there were these huge trees in the garden, and my first memory was some of them had to kind of be taken down, and so my very first memory is being fascinated by the whirring sound of the kind of the machines that they were using to saw through the trees, and the noise and the sound of the tree coming down. Wow. And then followed very closely by kind of always having been perhaps a touch too inquisitive for my own good. We had these chickens, and you kind of used to roam free range, as they'd call them these days. And again, it was not long after we moved to Car Road, and one of these chickens had chicks. And I was kind of really fascinated by this, and I got a little too close. And, I have this distinct memory of this mother chicken flying up, perching on my head. And
because you got too close to her chicks.
Chicks, yeah. And then, flapping her wings all over my face. I mean, she didn't have far to go because I was only about 3. But to this day, I have a healthy respect, and I give a wide berth to mother hens and their chicks, yeah.
That's a funny story. Do you think you got your fascination for medicine from your late dad? Or did that have any part to play in why you chose that career path?
Well, it was very much a second choice, actually.
What was the first choice?
Join the army. I've always been fascinated. My father was born and brought up in the north of Nigeria, in what is present-day Plateau State. And so I don't know if you ever heard the phrase, the Langtang Mafia. There's a whole bunch of his schoolmates. They went to school in a place called Gindiri, which is in Plateau, Gindiri Boys Secondary School, and a whole load of his schoolmates entered the army. So people like Joshua Dogunyaru, Amadu Ali, Ayuba Tensi, all those guys went into the army. And my very first memory of kind of the first time I really I thought, I want to do this, was in the middle of the Civil War, actually. I think it was about 1968. So it was not long after we moved to Car Road that I've just been telling you about. And Colonel Amadu Ali came home on leave from the war front in his uniform.
To your
house, yeah. So he and my dad sat down, and he was kind of, regaling him with battlefield stories from the front. Colonel Ali was a doctor, is a doctor, he's still with us. And I was utterly fascinated by this, fascinated by the stories, but fascinated by the uniform.
The uniform?
Yeah.
I was going to ask what you
thought,
think.
I could do this. And then shortly after that, I think a year after, General Gowon, who was then the head of state, came on a visit to Ibadan. And the then governor, late General Adebayo, accompanied him. They came on a visit to my primary school.
Wow.
And so I got a double dose of men in uniform. And from then it was a no-brainer. This was what I was going to do. My dad, however, had different ideas. And for those who knew my dad, he was not a man to be trifled with or argued with. So I told him I wanted to join the army, and his words were over my dead body. This was not long after the Dimka coup of 1976, when one of his classmates, later Ayuba Tense, was executed as a result of that coup. And I remember that when we used to go to Lagos, we'd go and say hi to him. He used to live in, I think it was Ann Barracks in Yaba in those days. And his house was the first place I'd seen, huge, massive aquarium. It was, literally about 4 or 5 foot high and about 6 or 7. It was a huge, massive thing. So I used to enjoy going when we went to Lagos to pop in and see him, A, because of the aquarium, and B, because I knew he was a soldier. Anyway, my dad said over his dead body was I going to join the army. So that was that, and I thought, well, what else can I do? Having been born and brought up in a medical world, I thought, okay. The other thing, of course, was I was also far too young when I left school to actually join the army.
What is the standard age for joining the army?
You have to be at least 17, and I did my O-levels when I was 14. So there was no chance that was going to happen. So I thought, all right, well, if I go to med school for 5 years, I will certainly be old enough. and with some luck also be big enough, because I didn't really start growing till I was 17.
Well, that's amazing that at that age you had the end goal of joining the army. So you backpedaled and thought, I will do XXX and be ripe enough to get into the army.
Well, yeah, this was wishful thinking, you see, because I thought, well, by the time I got a medical degree, maybe I might be able to persuade the old man that this is something to do after all. But as it happened, he died when I was in fourth year in medical school. So that obstruction was no longer there, and so at the earliest opportunity after I'd qualified, I did do that.
Oh, wow. What was the, and I don't know how much of this you remember, maybe you remember a lot of it. What was the direct impact of losing your dad at such a young age?
It gave me a healthy respect for how strong and resilient a woman my mother was. Because at that point she had 5 children, none of whom, my sister, who was the youngest, was still in secondary school. I was in fourth year, I think. In fact, my sister and my youngest brother were still in secondary school. My immediate two younger brothers were in university, but they were just starting out. Wow. Or were they even in? I can't remember. Anyway, I think they were. I think they were both in Trillium, one in Ife and one in Ibadan. And she had to kind of shoulder that burden by herself, with a lot of support from my father's friends, it has to be said. But it must have been, looking back, I think, geez, that must have been difficult. Yeah. So, I look at her now, frail, 89-year-old, but I just have an incredible respect for just how strong and resilient she was. And even without that, I think, would have been, I would have considered it a duty to kind of look after her in her own dotage. But I'd walk across burning coals for her. She has no idea who I am anymore. But,
oh no, she...
Yeah. But I think she has a vague recollection that this chap looks vaguely familiar. But there we are.
Wow. Did you, growing up, and maybe even till now, did you ever feel the burden of being the first child, especially the first son in a house like the one you grew up in?
Well, I was never allowed to forget it.
I'm very curious. How much do you think that impacts on your character and how that has formed? Do you think a lot of it has to do with the fact that you've, from an early age, had to always be, the first boy, pressure put on you?
I think it may have modulated some of my behavior to an extent, but I don't know that it really fundamentally changed my character. I think if anything, it was a very early lesson in how having to be a leader. And I think, what I've subsequently done has helped and magnified that. But I think, I had a very early introduction to the concept of leadership, including being responsible. So, there were times when I may not have been the direct culprit, but because I was the leader, I served the punishment alongside the culprit.
Yeah. So you're studying medicine at University of Ibadan, which is the same where you were born. How old are you at this point? So your dad passes when you're 19, and you finish 2 years later? Or?
Yeah.
And you were independent at this point. You're your own person, living out of home, and
Oh, I hadn't lived at home since I went to university at the age of 16. So pretty much I'd left home at 16. Kind of in the first year or so, or year and a half, you were kind of like regular university students with regular, academic calendars. But once you got to med school, all of that went out of the window because it just didn't follow the normal academic, September to June thing. It was year round with the odd week here and 2 weeks there kind of thing. I had left home, and in fact, there are things my siblings tell me about stuff that happened, which I had no knowledge of because I wasn't there.
Of course. Chapters in your family life.
I had no first-hand knowledge of. The other thing about going to medical school in Ibadan, of course, because I'd grown up with all the people who were now my teachers, and we now had to, they were very clear that the fact that I know who you are, it makes absolutely no difference to the fact that I'm teaching you medicine. And in fact, actually, what other students might have got away with, you couldn't.
Yeah,
so if you thought, I'd skip the odd lecture, they would notice you weren't there because they knew who you were.
Yeah.
Whereas all my classmates were, most of them were kind of anonymous faces.
Yeah.
That was. There were times when I resented that, but hey, we still found ways to get around it.
As you would.
Yeah.
So at the start, I said that in my research, you're a doctor, but also a lawyer, and also an author, and also, a list of accomplishments. Were you very academic, and is that why you sort of were able to pivot from one career path into another, or was it just your quest for knowledge? Was it the same inquisitive nature that kept pushing you and egging you on into different?
I think it's probably a mixture of everything. I don't know. I suppose I was a bit, one of my cousins recently described me to my wife as, that I was, what's known as an ITK when I was 5 years. Which for your viewers is I too know, smart ass kind of thing.
Yeah. Is there any merit to that? Is there?
Well, I couldn't possibly comment. But yeah, I did. In primary school, I went from primary 1 to primary 3. So I skipped the second year, and then so I did my O levels when I was 14 and my A levels when I was 16.
Which is quite young, actually, comparatively. I mean, most people.
I've always been at least 2 years younger than my contemporaries, academic contemporaries. So there was that. I did enjoy medical school, actually, even though it wasn't my first choice of career. But the reason the law thing came in was that in later years, when I was doing my postgraduate training as a forensic psychiatrist, that kind of you live cheek by jowl with the law. And I remember that my father had once said to me when I told him that I wanted to go to medical school. He said to me at the time that, Nick, I really think that your talents lie more in the arts than they do in the sciences. But if that's what you want to do, crack on. And I remembered that when I enrolled for my law degree on my very first day, I thought this is where I should have been all my life.
Do you know how rare that is that you took a medical route to end up in law like that? Because sometimes they're not polarizing, but most people, especially at the time I was going into secondary school, you chose science or the arts.
Yeah, that's what happened. I did the sciences.
Yeah, but to still end up in the arts and find that that's where your true calling was, you had to go through like that's really profound.
Yeah, or sad, depending on which way you want to look at it. So that's and a lot of my friends are lawyers, and I really enjoy kind of arguing law. I don't practice as a lawyer.
Okay.
If I practice anything at all, it's still medicine. But yeah, that really fascinated me, and it was a huge benefit having a legal qualification in my line of forensic psychiatrists spend a lot of time writing court reports and appearing in courts as expert witnesses, and if you know how the chap wearing a wig thinks, cross-examination becomes a lot easier.
Yeah. Oh wow, that's interesting. So you finish medical school. What prompted your migration to the UK? Was that something that was always in the plan, or how did that come about?
Well, it wasn't always in the plan. There were two things actually I think that triggered it. one was when I qualified, I then went and served with the Nigerian Army, the Brigade of Guards, because of course by now, Dad, the stop from Dad was now sadly no longer in the way. So I served with Brigade of Guards, and I wanted to convert. I wanted to become a regular combatant officer.
Wow.
Unfortunately, this were the bad old days when Nigeria was run by a military government, and when you're young, you think you know everything, but actually you can be pretty foolish. And I had apparently run my mouth once too often in the officers' mess, saying, because even then I was thinking, why are we trying to run a country? That's not what we do. Let the politicians run it. If they screw it up, let them fix it. It's not the Army's role. Anyway, so come conversion to commission time, and my then brigade commander came and said to me, really, really great guy, late General Joshua Madaki, said, look, I would keep you in a flash, but it's been made clear to me that from higher authorities that, and I will never forget this phrase because I always use it now, that I had more chance of winning the lottery and being struck by lightning on the same day than getting a regular commission, regular competent commission in Nigeria.
Wow.
So I thought, okay, well, all right. That's a shame. But with hindsight, actually, it was a huge blessing because at the time, there were 4 of us who shared a 4-bedroom flat in Dodan Barracks. Of the 4 of us, I'm the only one who's still alive. 2 were executed as a result of the Awka coup, and 1 was killed in Liberia. And, so I came over here. I left Nigeria in 1889. And joined the British Army.
Okay.
And went to Sandhurst. And I said, this is where my previous service really came. It's a huge advantage. So nothing that they threw at me at Sandhurst was new.
Right.
In fact, some of it was pretty small bear compared to what we'd. If the Academy Sergeant Major is listening, forget I said that. So anyway, that was, I joined the Army as commissioned in October of 89. No, I joined in October of 89, and I was commissioned actually the day before the Awka coup.
Wow.
On the 21st of April. 1990.
So here, I have something that struck me as interesting as you were speaking is, how is it that, because you lived in the reality of the Civil War, I guess growing up, you because you said earlier on that you go on, came to your primary school, and I've had other guests on the podcast who lived through it in different camps, some from the Nigerian camp and some from the Biafra state, and the realities that they describe are so grim and I don't have to say to you, I mean, I know you are well versed in that, but then also it's after sort of being in that experience and living through that, how is it that you still found the passion to want to be in a uniform, and not just to be in a uniform, but to be a combatant?
It's not for everybody. I think you need a special sort of mad to want to do that sort of thing. But it's just in you. It's just in your blood. It's over the years subsequently, kind of supported operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and Mali and Bosnia, Kosovo. And, I know from first-hand experience that war's not pretty. In fact, it's downright ugly. But as long as there are human beings on this planet, there will be wars, and therefore somebody's got to be able to fight them.
Yeah.
I don't know of a single soldier who will tell you that their first choice for anything is to go to war. It is a last resort. But there's one of my favorite sayings is I think it was Lucius Cornelius Sulla who said this, that qui desiderat pacem preparet bellum. He who desires peace prepares for war.
Yeah.
So it is what it is, and somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
And it better be somebody who actually quite wants to do it.
Wants to do it and is passionate enough to. Yeah. You have a book called Hubris.
Yes, I do.
And I have yet to read the book, and I have to be honest, but I have read the synopsis, and I have listened to an interview of you discussing about the book and reading a few chapters. It is a subject that fascinates me also because it talks about the history of the Nigerian Army and the makeup of it. especially how it relates to political power and everything else. I say it's, for everyone listening, it's definitely worth reading. And now some of that passion shines through in how you're describing always wanting to be in a uniform and still wanting to get into the army, even though you lived through the Biafra War and everything else. So we're fast forwarding now. So
well, just to say, my experience of the Biafran War was actually very detached because we were in Ibadan.
Of course.
I'm writing a book at the moment on the Civil War, in the course of which I've interviewed a lot of people who lived the reality of the war. So I've interviewed people who fought on both sides.
Wow.
I've interviewed many of my school classmates who were children in Biafra or on the edge of it. And their reality of the war is very, very different. I mean, the only thing I remember from that really changed for us as kids in Ibadan was that there was a particular chocolate drink called Balova, which was no longer available because of import restrictions. But in terms of everyday life, it really didn't impact that much. So, I can't say that, my experience of the war was a significant deterrent in terms of joining the armed forces. So I think it's important to be clear and upfront about that.
Yeah.
Subsequent experiences of war, albeit this time, I was significantly tall and I had a weapon in my hand. Didn't really make any change to that. It's a nasty, awful, horrible business, and no person in his right mind who has ever experienced war will kind of casually or willingly suggest. So I look at all these, especially younger chaps, in Eastern Nigeria who have no direct experience of the war, who are agitating for Biafra all over again. Like, you guys must be out of your minds.
Yeah. Youth.
Yeah.
So you move over to the UK when 89 you joined the army. What would you say is the key difference being in the army in Nigeria and being in the army in the UK?
There's a very big difference between being in an army that is in power and an army that is subjugated to civil power. Huge difference. In fact, it's like chalk and cheese. Because when you serve in an army that is in charge of a country, it's trying to run the country, it's no longer an effective fighting force. Because it has now transformed. That's the basis of Hubris, really. It is now transformed into a political organization. And then things like, professional competence, merit are no longer the metrics for career advancement. It's more where you come from, who you know, whose camp you're in. And those things can have a profound impact on things as fundamental as whether you live or die. So it's a huge difference. It's just completely incomparable.
Wow.
And I very strongly doubt, for example, and this may be a controversial comment, but hey, who cares? I don't think that if we still had a military government, the current counterinsurgency in Nigeria could have been fought anywhere near as effectively. In fact, I think part of the reason the war dragged on for 3 years was actually because the military were in charge of running the country. Because if you stop and think about it, the commander-in-chief, Gowon, was not actually effectively a military commander-in-chief. He was a political, because he was the head of state. And therefore his focus was not exclusively on his primary profession. At the time the war was being fought, there were all the kind of huge swathes of the experienced leaders had gone either through coups or execution or being appointed to political posts. And so you were finding situations where, people like late General Shehu Yaradua, who was commissioned in 1964, was a brigade commander in 1968. Come on, please. Gowon himself. And this is again something that I talk about in Hubris. And this is something that shocks people when I say it. At the time Yakubu Gowon became head of state at the beginning of August 1966, He was not yet 32. He was 31 years old. Wow. And the biggest thing he had ever commanded was a 30-man platoon.
Wow. Was that hidden, or was it public, public knowledge?
Yeah. The facts are all there. Just go look for them. He'd never commanded a company. And he had just been appointed to command a battalion when the January coup happened. And then he was made chief of army staff. And then he became head of state. I rest my case.
Wow. I don't think that's... Definitely never seen it through the lens of that. And I have researched some, about Yakubu Gowon and everything, but I've never thought about how that correlates to him being the head of state.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you another example. Murtala Muhammad, who's lionized quite inappropriately, in my view, was commissioned in 1961, in June 1961. He became a military head of state in July 1975. So that was 14 years. He was already a brigadier. 6 months later, he became a four-star general, and he had been in the army for less than 16 years.
Wow. That shouldn't happen?
That is because he was in a political post. That's the point I'm trying to make, that the pernicious effect of the army's involvement in politics, both on the army and on the country. I mean, I wouldn't have put my 31-year-old self in charge of running, branch at Tesco's. Never mind the entire country.
Yeah. Wow.
And I was significantly better educated than Gowon when I was 31.
So in a way, it's almost it shouldn't be a shock to anyone how things played out, because given the facts that were all there, it's just
absolutely not. I can't think of a single thing that we say is wrong with Nigeria today that does not have its origin in the fact that it was under military rule for so long. Nothing. Just stop and think about it. Military governments rule by decree.
Yeah.
There is no requirement for any kind of political horse trading, consensus. This is the way it's going to be, and that's it. And that saying about power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, has its apogee in military rule.
But there will be some who say that military rule has its merits, and they will talk about some of the bonus elements of what a country could be like under military rule. I mean, I don't...
Give me one example.
I was just about to say, I can't think of an example now, but in the sense of veto, you have less, this is just apolitically speaking, but you have less party divisions, because you have one voice saying this is what we do, right or wrong. You have one voice saying this is what we're doing, and this is how this is going to go.
Well, the trouble with that, of course, is that if they spoke with one voice, why have there been so many coups?
Yeah, well.
Because there will always be dissent. Okay, so the military has never spoken with one voice, especially in government. Never. It's just never happened. It's capricious. It's arbitrary. It's absolute. We describe ourselves as the Federal Republic of Nigeria. That is such a gross violation of the Trade Descriptions Act. There's nothing federal about Nigeria. It's a unitary government, because it is driven entirely by all the powers at the center. Who did that? It was the army. And progressively between 1966 and today, they just kind of moved the powers away from the regions and concentrated everything in the center, because that's how we think. We run a unified chain of command. As a divisional commander, you can't have 3 brigade commanders who are entirely independent doing their own thing. It's just not going to happen. So what we have at the moment is a central holding company called the federal government with 36 subsidiary companies, all of whom are entirely dependent on the holding company. And until that changes, we're not going to get very far. And that is what, that's the most obvious example of the pernicious effect of military rule. Think of just name it. It all comes back. Not a very popular opinion with my brothers in uniform, but hey ho.
Yeah, I wonder if your passion and your time in the military has evolved to you maybe having a voice politically. Is that something you've ever thought about? And I say this because you seem to have the best of both. You have the balance of having served in the military, but then now also seeing the wider effect of military rule and how that impacts politics in Nigeria. I wonder if you've ever considered or thought about been of use in that regard?
Not frontline politics. I mean, if I were, and it's there have been friends of mine who have expressed political ambitions, not all of whom I think are best suited for it. But there have been one or two that I have been quite happy to provide quiet support in the background in terms of advice and policy advice and all that sort of thing, and even tactical advice. But not as the frontline candidate. I don't think so.
You don't think so?
So yeah, that's. Yeah. I think I much prefer to operate in the shadows.
To take things back a little bit now, so part of my incentive for starting the podcast was when I lost my dad, we were really close, and we spoke a lot, and through knowing him, I did get to know more about my genealogy, where he comes from, and his father and his father's father, but up to a point. And I really have a strong feeling that not many people of my age and my generation have, if you like, the blessing of being able to do that or have connected those dots. How much do you think you are who you are based off of your genealogy, and how in touch are you with your lineage, where your father comes from and where his father comes from, and how much of that is sat before me today?
A fair bit is the short answer. My dad was the youngest of 10 children of his father.
Wow.
And as I said, we lost him when he was quite young. He was 48 when he died.
Oh wow.
So I know who I am. I know where I come from. My grandfather, in fact, the lineage is where Egbaz. And I am very fortunate today that I'm actually an Egba chief as well. So I'm very, very much in tune with that. So I was very honored to be made one a couple of years ago by Kabiyesi Alake, Okukenu IV. And in fact, just to kind of support that point, I've just written and published an illustrated history of the Alakes in Abeokuta since 1854. So it's stimulated, an interest and a desire in that. So there is a very strong connection to my heritage. There's another link in that, one of my father's half brothers who died recently was actually the person who designed Nigeria's flag.
Wow.
Michael Dr Akintunde Akinkunmi, I think he died about a month ago.
Wow.
But he was a student here in London when there was a competition when Nigeria was just about to become independent.
Wow.
So he entered the competition, and his design, the green, white, green we see today, won. So that's another another link to the wider Nigeria, not just my heritage.
Wow, that is that's a lot to embody for one person. You served in the Nigerian Army. Your relative designed the Nigerian flag that is still in use now. That's rich heritage. What would you say? What would you say is the best way, or how would you prescribe for people of my generation to connect the dots with their lineage, alive or not? What would be the easiest and probably more thorough way to trace yourself and just to align yourself with your heritage?
Read, ask questions. Because if you don't know where you're coming from, it is so much difficult to work out where you are, never mind where you're trying to get to. So, there is actually a fair amount of information out there if people can just be bothered to get off their asses and look for it. There's a whole load of archival information, whether it's published work, whether it's in archives, whether it's, books and articles, all that sort of stuff. But then, also don't be afraid to ask. So I remember, asking, when I was quite young, asking my dad, because his eldest brother, the first of the 10, was a police officer.
Oh, in Nigeria?
In Nigeria, yeah. I think he retired as an assistant commissioner of police, if my memory serves. But I remember photographs of him in his uniform, in the ceremonial police uniform. So I used to ask my dad, in fact, for a long time, I thought his brother was his father.
Wow. Oh, because of the age gap, I guess.
Yeah. I said, no. Because they used to call him Papa. So I said, no. So he told me about my dad. And I've kind of, through another cousin, kind of unearthed some photographs of my grandfather. And it's very striking, because my grandfather died 13 years before I was born. So I never met either of my grandfathers.
Really?
They both died before I was born.
Wow.
So I never met either of them. But having unearthed the photographs of my grandfather, it is really striking how very much like him my father looked.
Wow.
And my youngest brother also looks very much like him.
Wow.
And you think, yeah, okay, this is it. Ask, seek, you have the opportunity of Google these days. We didn't have that stuff. And it's amazing how much information is out there if you're willing to put the hard yards in and look for it.
Yeah. I wonder if you could speak to something that a few of my friends and I speak about a lot, which is I'm also I'm an immigrant, so I'm a first generation. I lived in Nigeria and I now live in the UK. Mm-hmm. Something that I think happens uniquely to people like me is, and I guess like yourself as well, is you get to a point where you no longer feel as Nigerian as people living in Nigeria, but you also don't feel quite as accepted as British born and bred Brits. Mm-hmm. So you're sort of in a no man's land as someone of the diaspora is. You're kind of half in, half out of either culture. And if you're not very careful, something I experienced was a displacement is you're not quite sure how to be, because when you speak with your Nigerian friends and Nigerian, family members, you realize you're not quite as, I don't know, I'm just going to say in quote, Nigerian as they are. Mm. But then in some other cultures, in the British culture and other European cultures, you also realize you're not quite as British. Mm. I wonder if you can speak to not why that is, because I feel like I have an understanding of why that is, but is that something you've ever experienced, and what was your coping mechanism?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And, I think that my experience is probably a little different to yours, but for a number of reasons. First of all is that having served for 30-odd years in the British Army, the way I explain it to my British friends is that, you put your life and limb on the line for Queen and country, and he was Queen then because I retired before His Majesty came to the throne, acceded to the throne last year. But a lot of soldiers will tell you that whilst there is that bigger picture, private blogs will tell you actually he fights because of his mates, his platoon, his section. And so it builds that kind of sense of belonging. The army is a hierarchical organization, but it's also actually kind of very close-knit fraternity and sorority. One must be absolutely correct these days. So I had this very curious thing that there are times, especially when I was in uniform, and you're out, you're on ops, you could all go to Ratchet at any moment. You feel British, but I don't feel English or Scottish or Welsh or Northern Irish.
Right.
So, for example, when my colleagues would get very excited that England were playing Scotland at football or rugby, went over my head. I couldn't give a hoot. In fact, my loyalties are much more tribal. We're playing Spurs. Arsenal are playing Spurs tomorrow.
Oh, you're an Arsenal man.
Yeah.
Oh,
so that is much more. But England playing Scotland at football or rugby makes zero difference to me. So I didn't I don't. Maybe my sense of disconnect wasn't quite as great because of the institution in which I kind of spent a large chunk of my life.
That is very key, actually.
The other side of the equation about not feeling Nigerian, I have never felt anything other than Nigerian. It's really so. My issue is not actually not fitting either. It's actually fitting in both. I think part of the reason why a lot of people of your generation may not necessarily feel as Nigerian as the Nigerians, actually, if you find out, many of them don't actually go back home frequently at all. So if you're here for years and then you're never in Nigeria, then how are you going to feel Nigerian? It's just not. Apart from an interregnum of 10 or so years, immediately after I left Nigeria, when, because of the Oka coup and all of that stuff that was happening, I really couldn't go back because, I say 2 of my flatmates were executed as a result of that coup. But apart from that, it's a very, very unusual year when I don't go to Nigeria at least half a dozen times.
Wow.
Sometimes up to 10 times. So I am in Nigeria frequently enough to not feel Nigerian, if you see what I mean. Then the fact that, I'm also now an Egba chief and all of that, so I'm very immersed in all of that. This time last week I was in Nigeria.
Yeah, we spoke and
So I think that's the other thing. And then, there are other things that kind of keep me plugged into Nigeria. My aged mum, I'm very strong. I helped to found a charity which supports undergraduate medical education in the medical school in Ibadan that I trained in. Wow. So I'm very kind of plugged and invested into that. And we kind of do quite a bit for the medical school. So I have never felt detached from Nigeria. I've always, I just kind of, the other thing which I tell people, which they find difficult to understand, is that I don't think in English, I think in Yoruba.
Really?
Yep, I think in Yoruba.
How does that play out? How is that in a practical sense? Are you not translating, but are you thinking, how does that play out?
I don't know. I couldn't explain it to you. But I think in Yoruba, and I speak in both, but I think in Yoruba. And I also, abuse people in traffic in Europe.
Yeah, which is good because they don't know what you're saying, and it just sounds tribal. Yeah. So another part of the picture that I like to kind of speak about, because I think it informs the totality of who you are, is you're a father, and I presume now also a grandfather. Mm-hmm. What was your journey like to getting married and deciding to have children, and and I chose the words carefully as to deciding, because I don't know, part of me feels like men decide and women accept or whatever.
No, you got that completely wrong. Women decide. Let's be absolutely clear about that.
Yeah, well, I stand corrected.
We think that we're in charge. Hell no.
They let us think that we're in charge. That's good.
Yeah. Here's the bottom line. Nigerians say, Yoruba women say that Iyalomo baba omo. Bottom line is that it's the woman who knows who's the father of the child. You may think you are.
Yeah.
Bottom line, it's the woman who knows who. I mean, I have never been. Well, it's maybe a lesson I learned the hard way. Not about paternity, but just about who's really in charge. I've been married twice, and so I have 4 daughters from my first marriage. And then, in my second marriage, I inherited two daughters and 4 grandchildren.
Oh, amazing!
So if I'm going to be brutally honest, I probably was I was a little bit too young when I first got married. I think I was 26 or something like that. Okay. I wasn't quite 27. So with hindsight, that was probably. But there are. If I hadn't done it, then I wouldn't have the 4 daughters I have today. And those young ladies wouldn't be, who they are without both of us. It is also important actually to point out that, whilst I was kind of running around developing 3 careers, they were pretty much, to a large degree, brought up by their mother. And with the benefit of hindsight, if I had to do it again, I might have made different priority choices and had been around a bit more. But, it is what it is.
Yeah.
We as men, as we alluded to earlier on, we like to think we're in charge. They quite happy to let us think that we're in charge, but bottom line, they, especially I found, with 6 daughters across the piece, the bond between a mother and her daughters, you are just a kind of useful side appendage. But, it is what it is. And I think, you know that and you know peace. And you kind of adjust yourself accordingly.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've always thought it was dads and daughters, mums and sons. But I don't know. Again, this is just off of my Hollywood knowledge, or I don't know. It's just what the story you're told. What sort of, and this is just between us, or between us, everybody listening as well, is what sort of dad are you? Would you say you were kind of a dad like your dad was your dad? Or did you have to pivot and be a different type of father?
I had to, very definitely had to pivot because, you are, my dad was being a dad in Nigeria in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a very different thing from being a dad in the United Kingdom in the 1990s and the 2000s. Different society. My father had 4 sons and then a daughter, my sister at the end. And we always used to see, my brothers and I used to think that, this girl got away with shit. we would never, ever have been allowed to get away with it. Never. So it was a different society. It was a different era. It was a different cultural milieu. So you couldn't carry. My father was very authoritarian. I often wonder why he didn't bloody join the army himself. And again, if I'm going to be honest, maybe I initially was kind of a little over the top with that. And you look back and you think, well, yeah, maybe I could have done things a bit differently. But no, I think I had to pivot. I really had to pivot, So all the things that you had to do, you have to do as a dad in this country, babysit, make food for the kids, bath time, school runs, Kumon lessons, athletics, horse riding, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, gymnastics. Yeah. It's glorified Uber driver sometimes.
That's my job description right now.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a huge privilege. It's a huge privilege to be a parent, to be a father. And now, with inherited grandchildren, I got two granddaughters, identical twins, who are 5 and a bit, 5.5.
Have you grown soft then? Are you a soft grandfather?
Ish. Ish. And then the 2 boys who are 3.5 and almost a year old. Yeah. So, yeah, you're kind of very soft. Although, there are times when I think, God, these children are a bit of snowflakes. No, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Which immediately produces floods of tears, but...
It's the job of grandfather.
Yeah.
Do you remember, and this is, I don't know if you do or no, or don't, but growing up, what was the soundtrack? What kind of music was playing on the house radio? What kind of music were you listening to growing up?
Oh, gosh. It was all the kind of, funk of the 70s, 80s, so Kool and the Gang, Shalimar, Dynasty, all of that stuff, Earth, Wind and Fire. you know. Interestingly, used to also listen to Sunny Ade, and I grew up being a Sunny man when it came to, you know, juju music. But actually, over the years, I've pivoted, and I'm very firmly now an Ebenezer Obey guy.
Really?
Very, very firmly an Obey guy.
Okay.
And so that is, you know, a lot of what you will hear in my car.
Is Ebenezer Obey?
The chief commander.
Wow.
Yeah. I was with him in Abeokuta last week. He came to play at Kabiesi's 80th.
Wow. That's amazing.
And his son, Tulu, who's also a musician who looks identical to his father, played at my Iwuye 2 years ago.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Those are some of my music heroes, and this, yeah. I'm enjoying the 6 degrees right now. And what about older? Were you, I guess, what kind of music were you listening to in your, I don't know, 30s, 40s? Because you're in the UK now, I mean.
I never kind of got into Britpop. Never.
Really?
Never.
Punk rock?
Nope. Absolutely not.
You never colored your hair, a different thing to...
In
the oil, yeah. To close out, what would you say, and you can approach this however you want, what would you say would be your greatest regret? And it's a 2-part question. So one is, what is your greatest regret? And the other part is, what would you say you would like your legacy to be? How would you like people who were nearest and dearest to you to remember you?
Okay, greatest regret is, you know, that I didn't spend as much time as I should have done with my kids when they were growing up. If I had to do that again, I would have made slightly different choices because, you know, there was too much of a focus on building my careers because I thought that was the way to do, and that's the way to provide for my family. But actually, there's a lot more to providing for your family than materially. You know, there's emotional side of it as well. So with the benefit of hindsight, I'd have done that differently. As far as the legacy is concerned, I think I would be very pleased if it was he did his best to be kind to people. And I think that's, you know, there's something I was reading in a Bible devotional the other day, and it was something about along the lines of, you know, God doesn't bless you so that you can become a reservoir of blessings. He blesses you so that you can be a conduit of those blessings to others, and that's the way I try and do things. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
I want to say a big thank you. It's been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
No worries at all. Thank you very much indeed for making the effort and for asking me.
Thank you.
All right.